Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dark little secret behind Valentine's Day, the holiday of roses, candle-lit dinners, heart-shaped chocolates, and historically speaking, public executions and goat sacrifices. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Before Valentine's Day became a carefully curated explosion of roses, candlelight, and strategically overpriced chocolate, mid-February in ancient Rome looked significantly less Instagram-friendly. And by less friendly, I mean there were goats involved. The festival was called Lupercalia. It took place around February 15th and was one of Rome's oldest celebrations, dating back to a time when subtlety was not part of the cultural vocabulary. It honored fertility, purification, and the legendary founding of Rome, specifically the cave where Romulus and Remus were supposedly nursed by a she-wolf, which already tells you this was not going to be a hallmark moment. The ceremony began inside that sacred cave. Priests known as Luperci sacrificed goats, and sometimes dogs, to the gods. The goal was purification and prosperity for the coming year. Now imagine the scene: chanting, animal sacrifice, stone walls echoing, 0 scented candles. The priests would then take the blood from the sacrifice and smear it onto the foreheads of 2 young noblemen. Immediately after, the blood was wiped away with wool dipped in milk. And, this is important, the young men were required to laugh. Yes, they were supposed to laugh while being ceremonially marked with goat blood, because apparently the gods appreciate good humour. But the ritual didn't end there. That would have been far too calm. The goat hides were cut into strips called februa, which is actually where the word February comes from. These strips were believed to carry purifying and fertility-enhancing powers. Then the young men ran through the streets of Rome, lightly striking women with the strips. And here's the part that feels like it needs a footnote. The women voluntarily participated. Why? Because being tapped with freshly sacrificed goat leather was thought to increase fertility and make childbirth easier. Modern dating advice could never. To be fair, Rome was obsessed with lineage. Producing heirs wasn't optional. It was survival. So while today we associate February with emotional vulnerability and awkward text messages, back then it was about ensuring your family line didn't vanish. No roses, no poems, just goats and optimism. Lupercalia was loud, physical, unapologetically pagan, and wildly successful in keeping mid-February relevant. And somehow, centuries later, this ritual would evolve into heart-shaped candy and handwritten love notes, from blood on foreheads to glitter on greeting cards. History really said, let's soften the branding. Now, as entertaining as goat hide fertility marathons were, there was a problem. Rome changed. By the 4th century, Christianity was no longer a small underground movement whispering in back rooms. It had become powerful, official, organized. Suddenly, public festivals involving blood rituals and semi-naked men sprinting through the streets started to feel awkward. You can't exactly preach spiritual modesty while the city calendar includes annual goat whipping day. So church leaders faced a dilemma. Lupercalia was wildly popular. People loved it. It was old. It was traditional. It was culturally embedded. You don't just cancel something like that without backlash. But you also can't keep it if you're trying to promote a more refined moral image. This is where history does what history does best. It rebrands. Instead of eliminating mid-February festivities entirely, Christian authorities gradually redirected the energy. They replaced pagan symbolism with Christian meaning. Sacrifice became martyrdom. Fertility rituals became saintly remembrance. It was not a clean overnight switch. It was a slow fade. Imagine centuries of, we no longer run through the streets with goat leather, but let's still gather in mid-February. Just differently. By the late 5th century, Pope Gelasius I officially condemned Lupercalia. He described it as improper and unchristian. Translation: we are not doing this anymore. But here's the genius part. He didn't erase the date. He filled it. February 14th became associated with Saint Valentine, a Christian martyr. Same season. New meaning. It's like changing the music at a party without cancelling the party. And this move was strategic. Humans love rhythm. We like our traditions. We expect certain times of year to feel special. So instead of fighting that instinct, the church redirected it. Out with goat sacrifices. In with saints. It worked. Slowly the fertility chaos softened. The rituals faded. The public spectacle disappeared. What remained was a day connected to devotion. And here's where it gets interesting. Because the man behind the name Valentine wasn't handing out roses. He was facing execution. Which means the holiday didn't become sweet overnight. It just changed its flavour. From livestock to martyrdom. Progress, technically. Now here's where Valentine's Day becomes historically confusing in the most inconvenient way possible. There wasn't just one Saint Valentine. There were at least two, possibly three, which already makes the branding messy. In the 3rd century, during a time when being openly Christian in the Roman Empire was not exactly a safe career path, several men named Valentinus were executed. One was reportedly a priest in Rome. Another was a bishop in Terni. Both were said to have been martyred around February 14th. And over time, their stories blurred together like ancient historical fan fiction. The most popular legend focuses on a Roman priest during the reign of Emperor Claudius II. Claudius, according to tradition, believed single men made better soldiers. No emotional attachments, no dramatic, I must return to my beloved distractions. So he supposedly banned young men from marrying. Was this an official empire-wide decree? Historians aren't entirely convinced. But the story stuck. According to legend, Valentine defied the emperor's order. He performed secret Christian marriages for young couples in candlelit ceremonies. Imagine that scene. Quiet rooms, whispered vows. A priest risking his life so two people could legally commit to each other. Romantic? Absolutely. Illegal? Very much so. Eventually, Valentine was arrested, which in ancient Rome usually meant things were about to escalate dramatically. Some versions say Claudius initially liked Valentine. Others say Valentine tried to convert the emperor to Christianity. Bold move. Either way, Valentine ended up imprisoned. Now here's where the story shifts from rebellion to poetry. While in prison, Valentine supposedly befriended, or even healed, the jailer's blind daughter. And before his execution, he sent her a note signed, "From your Valentine." Is there hard historical evidence for this letter? Not really, but it's beautiful. And history loves a beautiful detail. So what began as scattered martyr accounts evolved into a single romantic narrative. A rebellious priest, secret weddings, a prison letter, and an execution date that landed conveniently in mid-February. The goat festival was fading. The martyr story was rising. And slowly, love began attaching itself to the name Valentine, even if the man himself never intended to start a greeting card industry. History works in mysterious, and sometimes very convenient, ways. So now we have a rebellious priest, possibly a bishop, maybe both, operating in a Rome that was not particularly tolerant of Christian defiance. And we know how this story usually ends, not with retirement. Valentine was executed around February 14th, sometime in the 3rd century. Most accounts say he was beaten and then beheaded, which, as far as origin stories for romantic holidays go, is not exactly festive. There were no roses at the execution site, no violins swelling in the background, just Roman authority making a point. And here's where things get interesting. Martyrdom in early Christianity wasn't just tragic, it was powerful. Martyrs became symbols. Their death dates were commemorated annually. Their stories were retold, reshaped, sometimes embellished, because stories inspire. And a man who defied imperial authority to marry couples in secret, That's narrative gold. Over time, the details blurred. Different Valentines merged into one legendary figure. The secret weddings, the prison miracle, the farewell letter signed "From your Valentine." All of it combined into a single emotionally satisfying package. Was every part historically verified? Not exactly. But that almost doesn't matter, because by the 5th century, February 14th had an official association with Saint Valentine. And remember what happened to Lupercalia? It occupied the same time slot. This overlap was convenient. Instead of wild fertility rituals on February 15th, the church now had a solemn martyr to honour on February 14th. The chaotic pagan energy was replaced with structured devotion. It was a strategic pivot. Out with the goat leather, in with sainthood. But here's the twist. At this stage, Valentine's Day still wasn't about romance in the way we understand it today. It was a religious observance, a feast day, a remembrance of sacrifice. No heart-shaped anything, no love letters, no chocolate, just the quiet honouring of a man who died for his faith, and possibly for love. Which means the romantic transformation hadn't happened yet. That would require poets, and once poets enter the story, subtlety tends to leave. The execution gave the date weight, but poetry would give it wings. Up until this point, Valentine's Day was still relatively serious. A martyr, a feast day, a solemn remembrance. But then the Middle Ages happened. And with the Middle Ages came poets. Now, if there is one thing history has taught us, it's this. Once poets start attaching symbolism to something, that something will never be the same again. In medieval Europe, particularly in England and France, people believed that birds began their mating season in mid-February. Nature, apparently, had its own romantic calendar. And this is where Geoffrey Chaucer enters the scene. In the late 14th century, Chaucer wrote a poem called Parliament of Fowls. In it, birds gather on St. Valentine's Day to choose their mates. Just like that, February 14th gained a new association. Not martyrdom, not goat rituals, bird romance. Which sounds harmless, but culturally it was a shift. Chaucer was influential. His poetry travelled, and people love a good symbolic pairing. Birds finding partners on the same day humans commemorate a saint named Valentine. It felt poetic. Literally. Soon, the idea that Valentine's Day was connected to romantic love began spreading among the aristocracy. Nobles started exchanging handwritten notes and small tokens of affection around mid-February. These weren't mass-produced cards. They were personal, carefully written, often dramatic. Medieval love letters were not subtle. "Without you, my heart suffers endlessly" was a standard Tuesday. And because courtly love was a huge part of medieval culture, full of longing, distance, and elaborate declarations, Valentine's Day became a perfect stage for it. The saint himself, mostly sidelined. The martyr story, still there, but fading into background context. Now the focus was on emotional devotion. What's fascinating is how fast the tone shifted. Within a few centuries, a date once associated with execution was now becoming a socially accepted excuse to express affection. And it worked, because humans, across time, seem to need designated days to say things they're too awkward to say the rest of the year. So the poets did what they do best. They softened the edges. They layered symbolism over history. They turned martyrdom into metaphor. And suddenly, February 14th wasn't just about remembering a saint. It was about choosing someone. Birds first, humans quickly followed. And from there, the transformation only accelerated. Once the poets planted the idea, medieval Europe did what it always does with a good romantic concept. It escalated. By the 15th century, St. Valentine's Day had officially become an occasion for expressing romantic affection, at least among the educated and aristocratic classes. And unlike modern times, where you can send a heart emoji in half a second, medieval romance required effort, ink, paper, and dramatic flair. One of the earliest surviving Valentine messages dates back to 1415. Charles, Duke of Orleans, wrote a love poem to his wife while imprisoned in the Tower of London after being captured in battle. Yes, a Valentine written from prison, which, if you're noticing a pattern, fits perfectly with the holiday's slightly dark origin theme. In his letter, Charles referred to his wife as his very gentle Valentine. It wasn't commercial, it wasn't decorative, it was personal, intimate, and deeply poetic, and it set a precedent. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, exchanging Valentine notes became fashionable among the upper classes. These were often handwritten poems or declarations of affection. Some were sincere, some were strategic. Courtly love wasn't always pure. Sometimes it was political. Romance, after all, has always been slightly complicated. But what's important is this. The day was no longer just about a saint. It had fully transformed into a cultural moment for romantic expression. And because literacy slowly expanded, this tradition trickled down beyond nobility. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Valentine's Day was being observed more widely across England. Couples exchanged small gifts. Friends sometimes participated too. The tone shifted from purely solemn remembrance to emotional ritual. Still no chocolate factories yet, but we were getting there. What makes this phase fascinating is how quiet the transformation was. There was no official decree stating, "This is now a love holiday." It evolved organically. A martyr's date became associated with pairing. Pairing became poetry. Poetry became tradition. And tradition became expectation. By this point, February 14th was firmly tied to romance. The goat hide era was a distant memory. The execution was background history. Now the day belonged to lovers, and anyone brave enough to put feelings onto parchment, which in medieval times required both courage and decent handwriting. Up until now, Valentine's Day was still relatively exclusive. If you wanted to confess your love, you needed literacy, decent handwriting, and access to paper, which in earlier centuries was not exactly lying around in kitchen drawers. Then came the printing press. And once printing technology improved in Europe, everything changed. Because what had once been intimate and handwritten could now be reproduced. In the 18th century, printed Valentine cards began appearing in England. They weren't mass-produced in the modern industrial sense yet, but they were standardized. Decorative borders, romantic verses, pre-written sentiments for those who struggled with expressing feelings, which, let's be honest, has always been a large percentage of the population. Instead of composing your own heartfelt poem, you could now purchase one that said something like, "My heart burns with eternal devotion," without personally risking grammatical disaster. Efficiency. By the 19th century, especially in Britain and later the United States, the production of Valentine cards exploded. Advances in printing technology, cheaper paper, and postal systems made it easier than ever to send romantic messages. In fact, when postage rates became more affordable in the mid-19th century, Valentine's Day cards became wildly popular. Suddenly, romance had logistics. You could anonymously send a card, you could send multiple, you could participate without public embarrassment, which was revolutionary for socially anxious admirers everywhere. Entrepreneurs quickly noticed the demand. Companies began designing elaborate lace-trimmed cards, embossed decorations, and intricate paper cutouts. Some were genuinely beautiful. Others were dramatic to the point of emotional overcommitment. And here's the moment where something shifts again. Love was no longer just poetry. It was product. It had supply chains, manufacturing costs, profit margins. Valentine's Day was entering its commercial era, and this transition was subtle but powerful. What started as martyr remembrance evolved into romantic expression. Now it was becoming a seasonal industry. The saint was long gone from centre stage. The poets had done their work. And capitalism was quietly stepping into the spotlight. Because if humans are going to celebrate love, someone will eventually figure out how to sell it to them. History doesn't waste opportunities, especially profitable ones. By the 19th century, Valentine's Day had completed a remarkable transformation. From goat sacrifices to martyrdom, from martyrdom to poetry, from poetry to printed cards, and now, from printed cards to full-scale commercial strategy. In the United States, one name stands out: Esther Howland. In the 1840s, she began mass-producing decorative Valentine cards with lace, ribbons, and elaborate paper designs. They were elegant, romantic, and most importantly, scalable. She didn't invent romance. She monetized it, and she was wildly successful. As industrialization advanced, factories could produce large quantities of ornate cards quickly and cheaply. The postal system improved, cities grew, communication expanded. Valentine's Day became a predictable annual event that businesses could plan around. Predictability is beautiful in commerce. Florists noticed. Chocolatiers noticed. Jewelers absolutely noticed. By the early 20th century, Valentine's Day had solidified into a seasonal marketplace. Red roses became symbolic. Chocolate companies leaned into heart-shaped boxes. Greeting card corporations built entire departments around romantic messaging. And slowly, the cultural pressure increased. It was no longer simply an option to express affection. It became an expectation, which is a fascinating psychological shift. A day that began with defiance and execution now quietly measured emotional commitment through gift value. If you loved someone, you proved it. Preferably with something purchased. Now, to be fair, commercialization didn't erase sincerity. People still wrote genuine notes. Couples still exchanged meaningful gifts. But the scale changed. Advertising campaigns framed February 14th as a test, a moment, a deadline for love. Forget a gift? You're careless. Buy something modest? Questionable dedication? Skip it entirely? Risky move. The martyr Saint Valentine probably did not envision this. There's a strange irony here. A man remembered for defying imperial authority to perform secret marriages became the face of a multi-billion-dollar industry. Romance, once whispered in candlelight, now arrived with packaging and price tags. And yet, despite all the marketing, something deeper remained. Because beneath the commercial gloss, people still used the day to say what they struggled to say the rest of the year. The business model may have expanded, but the emotional core, however messy, endured, even if it now came wrapped in cellophane. By the 20th century, Valentine's Day was no longer just a holiday. It was a performance, and performances come with expectations. Advertising campaigns in the 1950s and 60s leaned heavily into the idea that love must be demonstrated, visibly, publicly, and ideally with a receipt attached. The more elaborate the gesture, the stronger the devotion. Dinner reservations became competitive sport. Restaurants filled weeks in advance. Florists doubled prices because, well, supply and demand is undefeated. And quietly, the tone shifted again. What had once been an optional romantic gesture turned into a social obligation. If you were in a relationship, you were expected to do something. If you were single, you were expected to feel something. Either way, February 14th had opinions about your personal life. That's a lot of pressure for a date originally associated with goat-hide whippings and martyrdom. Ironically, the more polished the holiday became, the more stressful it grew. Grand gestures replaced handwritten simplicity. Social comparison entered the room. Did your partner get you roses? How many? Were they red? Was there a card? Was it thoughtful? Did it cost enough? Somewhere along the way, love became measurable. And here's the darker layer. For many people, Valentine's Day amplifies loneliness. It highlights absence. It draws attention to relationship status in a way few other holidays do. A feast day once rooted in sacrifice and devotion evolved into a cultural mirror, one that reflects not just affection, but insecurity, which is fascinating when you consider the origins. Saint Valentine allegedly performed secret marriages out of conviction, not spectacle. Now the spectacle often overshadows the conviction, and yet, despite the commercialization and pressure, people continue participating. Why? Because ritual matters, even if the ritual is imperfect. Humans crave moments that mark connection, even if that moment is wrapped in pink packaging and mildly overpriced chocolate. Valentine's Day survived pagan Rome, imperial execution, medieval poetry, industrial printing, and corporate marketing. It adapted every time, and maybe that adaptability is its real story. Not perfection, not purity, but persistence. Even when the meaning shifts, the date remains. And every year, we return to it, with flowers in hand and history quietly watching. By now, Valentine's Day feels like a cultural juggernaut. Roses, reservations, relationship anxiety, and retail sales charts glowing with satisfaction. But here's the strange thing. The man whose name is on the holiday? He's mostly gone. Saint Valentine, the priest, the bishop, the rebel, the martyr, has faded into the background of his own feast day. Ask most people who Valentine was, and you'll likely get a shrug, maybe a vague something about love, which is ironic, because originally, February 14th wasn't about romance in the abstract. It was about remembrance. In the early church calendar, saints' feast days were serious. They honoured sacrifice. They recalled persecution. They marked the courage of those who refused to compromise their faith under threat. Valentine's execution would have been remembered with solemnity. Now? His name is printed on teddy bears holding plastic hearts, and this isn't necessarily tragic. It's just evolution. But it's fascinating how thoroughly the narrative shifted. The Church itself eventually removed St. Valentine from the general Roman calendar in 1969 due to the uncertainty surrounding his historical details. He wasn't erased from sainthood, but his universal celebration was reduced. Translation: even the institution that once promoted his feast day quietly stepped back. Meanwhile, the commercial holiday accelerated, which means the saint receded just as the symbolism expanded. Love became the headline. Valentine became the footnote. And yet, if you look closely, traces remain. The idea of devotion, the notion of defying authority for commitment, the romantic appeal of secret vows in dangerous times. These elements didn't disappear, they just lost their context. There's something poetic about that. A man remembered for risking his life to unite couples now presides over a day when couples debate dinner reservations. He defied an emperor. We debate dessert menus. It's a shift in stakes. But maybe that's how traditions survive, by shedding specifics and keeping emotion. The martyr story may be blurred, the historical details uncertain, but the core idea that love is worth marking, worth protecting, worth risking something for, still echoes faintly beneath the commercial gloss. You just have to listen past the advertisements, because buried beneath the roses and red wrapping paper, there's still a trace of rebellion, even if it now comes with a gift receipt. At this point, Valentine's Day feels like a holiday that reinvented itself every few centuries. Pagan fertility ritual, Christian martyr remembrance, medieval romantic symbolism, industrial age greeting card empire, modern commercial spectacle. But here's the deeper layer. Every version of Valentine's Day reflected control. Lupercalia was about controlling fertility and appeasing unpredictable gods. The Church's rebranding was about controlling cultural narrative, replacing pagan chaos with saintly order. Medieval courtly love, that was about controlling social expression. Romance had rules, rituals, structure. Even modern Valentine's Day carries subtle expectations about how love should look. Public displays, timed gestures, price tags. Each era reshaped February 14th to fit its values. And that's not accidental. Holidays are never just celebrations, they're mirrors. They reveal what a society prioritizes. Ancient Rome prioritized survival and reproduction. The early church prioritized spiritual devotion and martyrdom. Medieval aristocracy prioritized poetic longing and courtly symbolism. Industrial societies prioritized scalable sentiment. Modern culture? We prioritize visibility. If it isn't posted, did it happen? Valentine's Day now thrives on display. Social media announcements, gift reveals, perfectly staged dinners. The day became a showcase, and that adds another layer of irony. A holiday rooted in secrecy, secret marriages, hidden rituals, transformed into one of the most publicly performed days of the year. Private devotion became public validation. And yet, despite the performance, something authentic still slips through. Because beneath the spectacle, people genuinely want connection. They want to be chosen. They want reassurance. They want ritual acknowledgement. The commercial machinery may amplify it, but the emotional instinct predates the machinery. And that's why Valentine's Day never disappears, even when criticized, even when mocked, even when people claim they're over it. It persists, because humans like marking love. We always have. The method changes, the symbolism shifts. The goat hide whips are thankfully retired, but the impulse remains. February 14th is less about history and more about adaptation. Each generation rewrites it, and in doing so, unknowingly carries fragments of everything that came before. Even if they don't realize they're standing on layers of sacrifice, poetry, and very determined marketing departments. But no holiday grows this large without resistance. And Valentine's Day has critics. Lots of them. By the late 20th century, people began pushing back against the commercial pressure. The idea that love must be proven with purchases felt manipulative to many. Corporations were accused of manufacturing emotional deadlines, because apparently love now has a fiscal quarter. Movements emerged encouraging people to reject the holiday altogether. Some called it artificial, others labelled it exclusionary. Single individuals often felt the cultural spotlight a little too intensely on February 14th, hence the rise of alternatives. Valentine's Day, celebrating friendships. Self-love campaigns, anti-Valentine parties, sarcastic cards. In Japan, the holiday even evolved differently. Women traditionally give chocolates to men on February 14th, and then men reciprocate on White Day a month later. Structured romance with scheduled reciprocity, which honestly feels efficient. The backlash highlights something interesting. Valentine's Day is emotionally charged. People rarely feel neutral about it. They either lean into it fully or reject it loudly. And that emotional intensity tells us something. Even if people criticize the commercialization, they still acknowledge the power of the date. They react because it matters. If it were meaningless, no one would protest. Instead, every February, the internet fills with debates. Is it romantic? Is it capitalist? Is it necessary? Is it outdated? The fact that these conversations happen every year proves the holiday's grip. And here's the irony. A day that began with rebellion against imperial authority now inspires rebellion against corporate authority. Saint Valentine allegedly defied an emperor. Modern couples sometimes defy marketing campaigns. Different enemy, same spirit. Which suggests that perhaps the core of the holiday, resistance in the name of love, never truly disappeared. It just changed form. Some people celebrate, some abstain, some criticize. But no one ignores it completely, and that's the strange legacy of Valentine's Day. It refuses to fade. It provokes. It evolves. It adapts. And every year, it demands a reaction. Whether that reaction comes wrapped in roses or rolled in sarcasm. Either way, February 14th wins. Because you're thinking about it. So after all this evolution, from blood rituals to martyrdom to marketing, where exactly is the dark in Valentine's Day? It's not just in the beheading. It's not just in the goat sacrifices. It's in the uncomfortable truth about how love and power have always intertwined. Lupercalia wasn't just about fertility, it was about controlling it. Women lined up to be struck with goat hide strips because society told them motherhood was destiny. It wasn't romance, it was expectation. The martyr story isn't purely sweet either. If Claudius truly banned marriages, it was an act of control, limiting emotional bonds to strengthen military loyalty. Valentine's rebellion was romantic, yes, but it happened within a system that treated relationships as strategic liabilities. Even medieval courtly love, poetic as it sounds, often existed within rigid social structures. Marriages were political. Love was sometimes separate from obligation. The Valentine letters were beautiful, but many were written in societies where choice was limited. And modern Valentine's Day? It carries its own pressures. The expectation to perform affection, to spend, to prove devotion publicly, to avoid disappointing someone. Love becomes measurable, and anything measurable can become stressful. The darkness isn't that Valentine's Day is evil. It's that it has always reflected society's anxieties about connection, fertility anxiety, moral anxiety, social anxiety, loneliness anxiety. For some, February 14th amplifies absence rather than affection. It highlights who isn't there. It reminds people of what they lack. That doesn't make the holiday malicious, but it does make it powerful. Because anything that touches our deepest emotional needs, belonging, partnership, validation, carries weight. Valentine's Day has survived for centuries, not because it's harmless, but because it taps into something fundamental: the need to be chosen, the fear of not being chosen, and the willingness to risk something: reputation, safety, money, pride, in order to feel connected. That thread runs from ancient Rome to modern restaurants with fixed menus. The packaging changed, the stakes shifted, but the vulnerability remained. And vulnerability has always been a little dark, because when you open your heart, you risk more than embarrassment. You risk rejection. Saint Valentine risked execution. Modern romantics risk awkwardness. Different scales, same instinct. And that instinct, fragile, hopeful, and slightly terrifying, is what keeps February 14th alive. If you step back and look at the full timeline, Valentine's Day is one of the most impressive public relations transformations in history. Ancient fertility rites involving animal sacrifice, public martyrdom under imperial authority, centuries of political and religious tension, and now, heart-shaped pancakes. That doesn't happen accidentally. History has a habit of sanding down sharp edges over time. The parts that feel uncomfortable are gradually minimized. The parts that feel uplifting are amplified. No one writes greeting cards that say, "Thinking of you on this traditional Roman purification festival." We edit, we curate, we simplify. It's easier to celebrate love than to confront execution. It's easier to market roses than to explain religious persecution. So the narrative evolves. And this isn't unique to Valentine's Day. Almost every long-standing holiday carries layers that most people never see. Rituals change meaning. Symbols detach from origins. Dates survive even when their backstories fade. Valentine's Day just happens to be particularly dramatic. It went from blood to poetry to prophet, and each stage kept only what felt culturally useful. The church removed the pagan ritual but kept the timing. Poets removed the martyrdom but kept the symbolism. Businesses removed the solemnity but kept the sentiment. Every era trimmed something away, and what we're left with today is the softest possible version, which isn't necessarily bad. It just means we're celebrating the edited cut. The interesting part is that even though the darker origins are largely forgotten, they still exist beneath the surface. The rebellion, the sacrifice, the defiance, those elements shaped the holiday's emotional intensity. Even if we don't consciously think about them, they're baked into the date. And maybe that's why Valentine's Day still feels charged. It carries centuries of human urgency about love. Urgency born from danger, from restriction, from longing. It just expresses that urgency now through reservations and ribbon. History didn't erase the darkness. It wrapped it. And sometimes what's wrapped is more powerful than what's exposed, because we don't need to see the goat hide strips to feel the weight of connection. We just need a reason to mark it. And February 14th gives us one, softened, polished, and ready for retail. After everything, the goats, the martyr, the poets, the printing press, the corporate takeover, the backlash, You would think Valentine's Day might have faded at some point. Plenty of traditions have. Empires collapsed, festivals vanished, entire belief systems dissolved into footnotes. And yet February 14th is still here. Why? Because beneath all the rebranding, all the commercialization, all the eye-rolling and sarcasm, the core theme never stopped being relevant. Connection. Humans are not built to ignore that. Ancient Romans worried about fertility because survival depended on it. Early Christians risked persecution because belief and loyalty mattered more than safety. Medieval lovers wrote dramatic poetry because longing demanded expression. And modern couples, despite the marketing pressure, still want to feel chosen. That's the constant. The forms change, the costumes change, the messaging changes. But the emotional engine underneath remains the same. Valentine's Day persists because it touches something primal, the need to be seen and valued. Even people who claim to hate the holiday are responding to it. They mock it. They reject it. They host anti-Valentine parties. They post sarcastic memes, which still means they're participating, because indifference would be silence. And February 14th rarely receives silence. It provokes reaction. It demands acknowledgement. It forces reflection on relationships, romantic or otherwise. That's power. The dark story of Valentine's Day isn't that it was born in blood or shaped by execution. It's that it reveals how much humans invest in love, even when love is inconvenient, expensive, awkward, or risky. Saint Valentine allegedly risked his life. Medieval lovers risked reputation. Modern romantics risk embarrassment. Different centuries. Same vulnerability. And maybe that's why the holiday refuses to disappear. Because as long as humans crave connection, they will mark it somehow. Even if they pretend not to care. Even if they roll their eyes at the marketing. Even if they swear they're skipping it this year. February 14th survives because it adapts. It sheds skins. It reinvents itself. But it always circles back to the same fragile truth. Love is powerful. And power, throughout history, has never been entirely safe. For most of human history, chocolate was not a bar, not a square, not a bite-sized temptation hidden in your desk drawer. It was a drink, and not even a particularly friendly one. Among the Maya and later the Aztecs, cacao was ground into a paste and whisked into water until it frothed. It was often flavoured with chili, maize, or spices. It was bitter, earthy, and sometimes aggressively spicy. This was not dessert. This was ritual fuel. It was consumed during ceremonies, offered to gods, and even used as currency. If you dropped your chocolate in the dirt, congratulations, you just spilled money. When cacao crossed the Atlantic in the 16th century, Europe did what Europe does best. It added sugar. The Spanish elite embraced chocolate as a fashionable drink, and soon it spread to France and England. By the 17th century, chocolate houses were popping up in London, social hubs where aristocrats gathered to sip thick, sweetened cacao and discuss politics, gossip, and probably other aristocrats. But here's the key detail. Chocolate was still liquid. Technologically, that mattered. Ground cacao beans naturally contain cocoa solids suspended in cocoa butter, a fat that melts at body temperature. When mixed by hand, the result was uneven and gritty. If you tried to let it harden into a solid block, you get something chalky, crumbly, and oily all at once. Imagine biting into a candle that tastes vaguely like bitterness and regret. There was no smooth snap, no glossy surface, no creamy melt. Chocolate remained a beverage because that was the only way it behaved properly. The fat content made it unstable, and production methods were crude. Grinding stones, hand mixing, and inconsistent roasting meant texture was unpredictable. It was closer to medicinal sludge than indulgent confection. And yet, Europe was hooked. Demand grew. Sugar plantations expanded. Cocoa imports increased. The appetite for chocolate intensified. But always in a cup, never in your hand. The idea of a solid chocolate bar didn't fail because people lacked imagination. It failed because they lacked control over cocoa butter. That control, the separation and recombination of fat and solids, would take the 19th century to master. And when it finally happened, chocolate would stop being something you sipped slowly by the fire and start becoming something you devoured without thinking twice. If chocolate was ever going to become a solid bar, one stubborn obstacle stood in the way: cocoa butter. Cocoa beans are naturally about half fat. That fat, cocoa butter, is what gives chocolate its melt-in-your-mouth quality. But in the early 19th century, it was also the reason chocolate refused to behave. When manufacturers ground cacao into paste, the result was heavy, greasy, and inconsistent. Sometimes it hardened like a brick. Sometimes it stayed soft and crumbly. Either way, it was more suitable for scraping into drinks than moulding into tidy little rectangles. And that simply would not do for an industrial age obsessed with uniformity. Enter the age of machines. Steam engines roared. Factories expanded. Textiles were mechanized. Sugar production soared thanks to Caribbean plantations and European beet fields. Everything was being refined, pressed, and optimized. So why not chocolate? In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Konrad van Houten developed a hydraulic press that could squeeze much of the cocoa butter out of ground cacao mass. What remained was a defatted cake that could be pulverized into fine cocoa powder. It dissolved more easily in water. It was smoother. It was cheaper. It was revolutionary. But here's the twist. By removing cocoa butter, Van Houten accidentally created the missing piece needed to invent solid chocolate. Because once you separate the fat from the solids, you can control the ratio. That was the breakthrough. Instead of accepting whatever natural balance the bean provided, manufacturers could now remove cocoa butter, refine the cocoa solids, and then recombine them in precise proportions. More fat for smoothness, more solids for intensity, sugar for sweetness, milk, eventually, for softness. For the first time, chocolate could be engineered. It sounds obvious now. Separate, refine, recombine. But at the time, this was radical. Food was not yet a laboratory science. Texture was not yet engineered for mass pleasure. Yet here it was, chemistry shaping craving. The cocoa butter problem was no longer a curse, it was leverage. And once chocolate could be controlled, shaped, and standardized, it was only a matter of time before someone realized that this once ceremonial drink could be pressed into something far more portable. Not a cup, a bar. And once that idea took hold, there was no turning back. Once cocoa butter could be separated and controlled, someone eventually had to ask the obvious question: what if we put it back together? Properly. That someone was Joseph Fry, an English chocolatier working in the mid-19th century. In 1847, Fry and his company discovered that by adding melted cocoa butter back into cocoa powder, along with sugar, they could create a paste smooth enough to pour into moulds. When it cooled, it hardened into something astonishing. Not powder, not drink, not crumbly sludge, a solid. For the first time, chocolate could be held in the hand. Now, let's not romanticize it too much. Fry's early chocolate bars were not the silky treats we know today. They were coarse, slightly gritty, and still somewhat bitter. Think less luxury dessert and more industrial brick with ambition. But it was revolutionary all the same. This was the moment chocolate changed form, from liquid indulgence to portable pleasure. And portability changes everything. Drinking chocolate required time, cups, hot water, a social ritual. It was aristocratic, slow, ceremonial, but a solid bar that could be wrapped, shipped, sold, and eaten anywhere. No preparation required, no etiquette necessary, just unwrap and bite. This shift aligned perfectly with the Industrial Revolution. Urban workers needed quick energy. Sugar and fat delivered exactly that. Chocolate bars became compact calorie bombs, sweet, stimulating, and shelf-stable. Perfect for factories, travel, and eventually military rations. But there was still a problem: the texture. Even with recombined cocoa butter, early chocolate was rough on the tongue. Sugar crystals remained large. Cocoa particles were uneven. It melted, yes, but not luxuriously, not seductively. The idea was there. The chemistry worked. The mold existed. But chocolate had not yet become addictive in the way we understand today. It needed refinement. It needed silkiness. It needed to glide instead of crumble. And that next transformation would come from another innovator who refused to accept good enough. Because the invention of the modern chocolate bar wasn't just about making chocolate solid, it was about making it smooth. And smooth, as it turns out, is where obsession begins. If Joseph Fry gave the world solid chocolate, Rodolphe Lindt gave it something far more dangerous: smoothness. By the late 19th century, chocolate bars existed, but they still felt rustic, gritty, slightly sandy. You could taste the sugar crystals. You could feel the cocoa particles stubbornly clinging to your teeth. It was edible, yes, pleasant even, but it wasn't luxurious. Lindt, a Swiss chocolatier with mechanical curiosity and a stubborn streak, decided that wasn't good enough. In 1879, he developed a machine that would quietly transform chocolate forever: the conche. The name sounds elegant, and so was its effect. The conche was essentially a large mixing device that kneaded chocolate for hours, sometimes days, while gently heating and aerating it. This continuous motion broke down sugar and cocoa particles into microscopic sizes. It redistributed cocoa butter evenly. It evaporated unwanted acidic notes. The result? Chocolate that melted smoothly across the tongue. Not crumbly, not chalky, not heavy. Velvet. This was more than an improvement in texture. It was a psychological shift. When chocolate melted seamlessly in the mouth, it triggered a completely different sensory experience. Creamy fat coating the tongue. Sugar dissolving instantly. Aromas blooming without resistance. It no longer felt like processed food. It felt indulgent. And indulgence sells. The conching process also made chocolate more consistent and stable, perfect for large-scale production. What had once been artisanal and unpredictable could now be standardized. Factories could replicate that same silky finish batch after batch. Chocolate was no longer just solid, it was seductive. Meanwhile, Switzerland was becoming a chocolate powerhouse. Precision, engineering, patience. The Swiss did not invent chocolate, but they perfected its texture. And once consumers experienced truly smooth chocolate, there was no going back to gritty bars. Texture creates memory. Memory creates craving. By the end of the 19th century, chocolate had evolved from a ceremonial drink to a molded solid to a refined melt-in-your-mouth confection. It was no longer just a treat for the elite. It was becoming something far more universal, accessible, portable, comforting. And just as chocolate was becoming irresistibly smooth, another innovation was about to make it even more approachable, especially for those who found dark chocolate a little too intense. Because what's better than smooth? Smooth and sweet. And that's where milk enters the story. Dark chocolate was bold, bitter, intense. It demanded appreciation. Milk chocolate, on the other hand, whispered, "Relax." The man responsible for that shift was Daniel Peter, another Swiss chocolatier and neighbour of Henri Nestlé. Yes, that Nestlé. In the 1870s, Peter had a simple but maddening problem. He wanted to add milk to chocolate to make it sweeter and softer, but fresh milk contains water, and water is chocolate's enemy. It causes clumping, seizing, and general chaos. For years, he experimented and failed. Add milk directly, and the chocolate spoiled. Remove too much moisture, and you lost the creamy effect. It was a balancing act between chemistry and frustration. The breakthrough came when Peter began using condensed milk, a product Henri Nestlé had perfected as a way to preserve dairy. Condensed milk had far less water and far more stability. In 1875, Peter successfully created the first stable milk chocolate, and just like that, chocolate became friendlier. Milk softened the bitterness of cocoa. It lightened the flavour. It made chocolate creamier, sweeter, and more approachable. especially for children and those who didn't want their dessert tasting like a philosophical experience. This was not just a flavour change, it was a market expansion. Dark chocolate appealed to adults with refined tastes. Milk chocolate appealed to everyone. And once milk chocolate proved viable, production exploded. Factories scaled up. Branding emerged. Wrappers appeared. Chocolate shifted from being a luxury delicacy to a household staple. Milk chocolate was smoother, sweeter, more comforting. It also happened to be more addictive. Sugar content increased. Fat content remained high. The combination of cocoa butter and dairy fat created an even richer mouthfeel. The brain, quite frankly, approved. By the late 19th century, chocolate was no longer just a European aristocratic drink or a slightly gritty bar for industrial workers. It was a creamy, wrapped indulgence that could be sold to the masses. And once the masses tasted it, there was no going back. Chocolate had completed its transformation, from sacred drink to engineered bar, from ritual to commodity, from bitterness to bliss. But something else was happening behind the scenes. As chocolate became smoother and sweeter, it also became global, relying on vast plantations, industrial labour, and expanding colonial trade routes. Because while chocolate melted gently on the tongue, its journey to the wrapper was anything but gentle. By the late 19th century, chocolate had done something extraordinary. It had stopped being sacred. It had stopped being aristocratic. It had become industrial. Once cocoa butter could be separated and recombined, once conching perfected smoothness, and once milk made it sweeter, chocolate was no longer a delicate novelty. It was scalable. And scale is where revolutions really happen. Factories in Britain, Switzerland, Germany, and later the United States began producing chocolate in enormous quantities. Steam-powered machinery refined cacao, rolled it thin, conched it smooth, poured it into moulds, cooled it, wrapped it, shipped it. Chocolate was now a product of rhythm and repetition, and the timing could not have been more perfect. Industrial cities were swelling with workers. Long shifts, low pay, exhaustion. People needed quick energy that was cheap, portable, and satisfying. Chocolate delivered all three. Sugar gave rapid fuel. Fat gave sustained calories. Caffeine and theobromine provided a subtle lift. It was, in many ways, the 19th century's energy bar, except it tasted better. Companies quickly realized that chocolate wasn't just food. It was morale. It was comfort during harsh urban life. It was affordable indulgence in a world that offered little softness. Brands began forming identities. Packaging became colourful. Logos emerged. Advertisements framed chocolate as wholesome, romantic, nourishing. Mothers gave it to children. Soldiers carried it in rations. Travellers packed it for long journeys. The bar format made all of this possible. You couldn't hand someone a steaming cup of drinking chocolate in a factory line, but you could slip a wrapped bar into a pocket. And this portability changed consumption patterns forever. Chocolate was no longer tied to a table or a ceremony. It became impulsive, bite-sized, immediate. It could be eaten alone, and that may have been its most powerful transformation of all. Chocolate shifted from social ritual to personal pleasure, a private sweetness in a noisy mechanical world. But while factories hummed and consumers smiled, another reality expanded quietly in the background. Cacao does not grow in Europe, it grows near the equator, which meant the explosion of chocolate demand required plantations, vast ones, across West Africa, South America, and parts of Asia. And that global appetite would come with consequences, because every revolution has a shadow, even the sweet ones. By the time the chocolate bar became smooth, sweet, and portable, demand began to rise faster than anyone expected. Europe could refine chocolate, but it could not grow cacao. Cacao trees thrive in humid tropical climates, within a narrow band near the equator. So as chocolate factories multiplied in Britain, Switzerland, and beyond, their lifeline stretched thousands of miles south. West Africa became central. So did parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia. Plantations expanded rapidly. Entire economies reshaped themselves around cacao exports. Ships moved beans north. Profits flowed back, unevenly. The modern chocolate bar was born in laboratories and factories, but it depended on fields far from European storefronts. And those fields were not always gentle places. As demand surged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, production intensified. Colonial systems ensured cheap land and cheaper labour. The world's sweetest treat became deeply tied to imperial trade networks. Consumers biting into a smooth milk chocolate bar rarely considered the journey behind it. They tasted creaminess. They tasted sugar. They tasted comfort. They did not taste logistics. But logistics were everything. Cacao beans were fermented under banana leaves, dried in the sun, packed into sacks, shipped across oceans, unloaded at docks, roasted in factories, ground, pressed, recombined, conched, tempered, moulded, wrapped. The entire chain had to function perfectly for that satisfying snap when a bar breaks, and that snap became addictive. As chocolate grew cheaper and more available, consumption soared. It was no longer reserved for holidays or special occasions. It became everyday, casual, routine. Children received it as treats. Workers bought it during breaks. Soldiers carried it during wars. Travellers stocked it for long trips. Chocolate stopped being exotic. It became normal, which is perhaps the most powerful transformation of all. When something moves from rare to routine, it stops feeling extraordinary, even if its journey remains extraordinary. By the early 20th century, the chocolate bar was no longer an invention. It was an institution, but the story does not end with milk and factories. Because once chocolate became stable, smooth and scalable, innovation didn't stop. It accelerated. Caramel would come. Nuts would come. Fillings, coatings, aeration, branding wars, mass marketing. The modern chocolate bar was only the beginning. What followed was not just refinement. It was domination. Once chocolate bars became stable and global, the race shifted from invention to optimization. Now the question was no longer, can we make solid chocolate? It was, how do we make people want more of it? And this is where science leaned in closer. Manufacturers began experimenting with ratios, sugar levels, cocoa percentages, milk solids, fat content. Slight adjustments changed mouthfeel dramatically. A little more cocoa butter meant faster melt. Finer grinding meant smoother glide. Higher sugar meant quicker dopamine response. Chocolate was no longer just confectionery. It was chemistry designed for pleasure. Tempering techniques were perfected to create that satisfying snap when a bar breaks. Aeration methods introduced bubbles for lighter texture. Caramel layers added chew. Nuts added crunch. Wafer layers added contrast. Each addition manipulated sensory response. Texture became strategy. Smooth plus crunch, sweet plus bitter, creamy plus crisp. Every bite engineered to keep the brain curious and engaged, and the brain responded enthusiastically. Chocolate stimulates reward pathways through a combination of sugar, fat, and mild stimulants like theobromine. None of these alone are overwhelming. Together, they create balance, just enough stimulation without overload. It melts at just below body temperature. That was no accident. Cocoa butter's melting point means chocolate liquefies almost instantly on the tongue, coating taste buds before the brain fully processes what happened. It feels luxurious, and luxury becomes habit. By the early 20th century, chocolate companies understood branding as well as chemistry. Advertisements portrayed chocolate as romantic, comforting, energizing. Soldiers were given bars during wartime. Children saw it as reward. Adults saw it as indulgence without guilt. It became emotional. A small square for stress. A full bar for heartbreak. A gift for affection. The modern chocolate bar had evolved into more than food. It was psychological shorthand for pleasure. And because production was industrialized, prices dropped further. What was once sacred ritual became supermarket staple, affordable, portable, engineered. A global addiction wrapped in foil. Yet, despite all this refinement, chocolate's core formula remained rooted in that 19th century breakthrough. Separate cocoa butter, recombine it carefully, refine texture relentlessly. Everything else was variation, and variation would explode in the decades ahead. Because once you understand how to perfect craving, you start building empires around it. By the 20th century, the modern chocolate bar was no longer a novelty of chemistry. It was a cultural icon. What began in the 19th century as an experiment in separating cocoa butter had transformed into something far larger than a food product. Chocolate bars became symbols of comfort, of celebration, of romance, even of childhood itself. Companies built empires around them. Factories grew larger. Assembly lines became faster. Packaging became brighter. Chocolate bars were no longer sold as mysterious luxuries. They were marketed as everyday companions. Lunchbox staple, movie snack, holiday gift, emergency mood repair tool. Wars accelerated their reach. Soldiers in both world wars were issued chocolate as part of their rations. Compact, calorie-dense, morale-boosting. Chocolate travelled with armies, crossed continents, and embedded itself in national memory. For many, the taste of chocolate became tied to survival, relief, or even nostalgia. And then came mass media, radio, posters, later television. Chocolate was advertised as wholesome, energizing, romantic, even patriotic. It was framed as reward for hard work, as proof of affection, as small luxury accessible to all. It had fully shed its aristocratic past. The transformation from sacred Mesoamerican drink to industrial global obsession was complete. Yet underneath every wrapper, the core remained the same 19th century formula. Cocoa solids refined, cocoa butter controlled, sugar blended, milk added, conched to silk, tempered to shine. The invention of the modern chocolate bar was not one single moment. It was a chain reaction. Van Houten separating cocoa butter, Fry moulding the first solid bar, Lindt inventing smoothness, Peter adding milk. Each innovation stacked upon the last, and together they created something deceptively simple. A rectangle, a snap, a melt. But behind that simplicity lies chemistry, colonial trade routes, industrial machinery, marketing psychology, and a carefully engineered balance of fat and sugar that the human brain finds deeply satisfying. Chocolate did not just change form in the 19th century. It changed identity, from ritual to retail, from sacred to snack, from drink to global addiction. And today, when you unwrap a chocolate bar, you are holding more than a treat. You are holding the result of a quiet industrial revolution, one that turned bitterness into bliss and chemistry into comfort, all because someone figured out how to separate the butter and then put it back better than nature ever did. Step into a London alley in the mid-19th century, and the first thing you notice is not the food, it is the air. Coal smoke drifts like a permanent fog, clinging to brick walls and settling into clothes. Chimneys belch without apology. The street is slick from rain, mud, and whatever the horses left behind. The Thames nearby contributes its own industrial perfume. This is not a romantic, foggy postcard London. This is working London. And somewhere in that thick grey haze, a man is shouting about hot pies. Victorian street food did not announce itself with elegance. It shouted, it steamed, it sizzled in open air. Vendors balanced trays over their shoulders, or pushed wooden barrows fitted with charcoal braziers. Flames glowed beneath iron pans while customers hovered impatiently, coins clenched in rough hands. There were no storefronts for most of them, no proper kitchens, just portable heat and whatever could be cooked quickly enough to sell before the next wave of customers arrived. London was swelling in size during the Industrial Revolution. Workers poured into the city for factory jobs, dock work, construction. They lived in cramped rooms, often without proper cooking facilities. Many left home before dawn and returned after dark. Sitting down to a home-cooked meal was a luxury few could manage. Street food filled the gap. It had to be cheap. It had to be filling. And most importantly, It had to be fast. Baked potatoes roasted directly over hot coals on the pavement. Vendors split them open with a knife blackened from use, added a lump of butter if the customer could afford it, and handed them over wrapped in paper. Steam curled into the cold air as men and women ate standing, leaning against soot-stained walls. Eel pie sellers wove through crowds. Pea soup simmered in dented pots. Penny sausages hissed over flame. Everything was eaten on the move. No forks, no napkins, no ceremony, just hunger meeting heat. Victorian street food was not about refinement. It was about endurance. In a city that ran on steam engines and human labour, these greasy, portable meals were the fuel that kept everything turning. Between the smoke and the shouting, supper did not wait for comfort. It happened wherever you were standing. If Victorian London had a signature street flavour, it was eel. Not roasted pheasant, not beef roast. Eel. The Thames, long before strict pollution controls and modern sanitation, was thick with them. Eels thrived in muddy riverbeds and could survive conditions that would make other fish surrender immediately. They were slippery, abundant, and, most importantly, cheap. Cheap is the magic word. For working-class Londoners, affordability mattered more than elegance. And eel pie was exactly that. Practical protein wrapped in pastry. Picture it. A street vendor with a wooden tray slung over his shoulder, tin pies stacked carefully inside. He calls out through the din of wheels and hooves. Dock workers pause. Labourers reach into pockets for a few coins. A pie is handed over. Warm, heavy, smelling faintly of river and pepper. The eel inside was chopped, seasoned lightly, and baked into a simple crust. Nothing decorative, nothing refined, just fish and pastry designed to quiet hunger fast. But eel did not stop at pie. There were stewed eels, fried eels, and perhaps most famously, jellied eels. Jellied eels were made by boiling the fish and allowing the natural gelatin in their bones to set as they cooled. The result was pieces of eel suspended in a clear, savoury jelly. To modern sensibilities, it may look like a culinary experiment gone wrong. To Victorians, it was normal. It was filling. It was local. It was affordable. Street stalls served them in simple bowls, sprinkled with pepper or vinegar. People ate them standing, sometimes wiping their mouths with the backs of their hands before returning to work. Eel became so central to London's street food culture that dedicated eel houses appeared in poorer districts. They were not elegant establishments. Wooden benches, damp floors, steam rising from pots. But they were warm. And warmth mattered. The irony, of course, is that the Thames, source of this cheap abundance, was also heavily polluted by the same industrial expansion that drove the city's hunger. Yet necessity rarely waits for perfection. Victorian street food was not about pristine sourcing or aesthetic plating. It was about making the most of what the city offered. And in a city built along a river, the river fed the streets. One slippery pie at a time. If eel was London's river gift, the baked potato was its smoky street hero. You could smell them before you saw them. A faint sweetness rising from hot coals. The earthy scent of skins blistering in open braziers. Vendors stood beside small metal ovens mounted on carts, charcoal glowing beneath wire racks stacked with potatoes. No fine china, no plated garnish, just heat, ash, and timing. Potatoes were ideal street food. They were cheap. They were filling. They required little preparation. And most importantly, they could be cooked right there on the pavement. A vendor would slit one open with a quick flick of a knife. Steam burst out, fogging the cold air. If you had a few extra coins, you might get a small knob of butter pressed into the centre. If not, perhaps just salt. Either way, it was hot, heavy, and comforting. And in Victorian London, comfort was currency. The Industrial Revolution did not create leisurely lunch breaks. Workers often had only minutes between shifts or tasks. A baked potato could be eaten quickly, without cutlery, while standing in an alleyway. It required no plate and left little waste. The skin acted as its own wrapper. It was edible architecture. Potato sellers became a common sight at night. As temperatures dropped and fog thickened, the glow from their braziers drew crowds. The light from the coals flickered against soot-streaked faces. Conversation was brief. Coins exchanged hands. Food changed ownership. There was something almost communal about it. Dozens of strangers clustered around warmth, each holding a simple meal, each equally tired. Of course, hygiene was flexible. Hands that handled coins also handled food. The same knife might split 100 potatoes before seeing water. But most customers were not concerned with invisible threats. Their concerns were immediate: hunger, cold, fatigue. The baked potato did not promise elegance. It promised relief. And sometimes that is enough. Unlike eel, which carried the scent of the river, the potato felt neutral, earthy, safe, familiar. It did not challenge the palate. It did not require explanation. It simply filled the stomach. In a city powered by coal and human endurance, the baked potato was the edible equivalent of a coal ember, modest, glowing, dependable. And for many Londoners, that quiet dependability was worth far more than culinary refinement. If baked potatoes were the quiet comfort of the streets, pea soup was the warm embrace you could drink. You did not order pea soup in Victorian London. You encountered it. A vendor stood beside a dented metal pot balanced over coals, steam rolling upward in thick clouds. The air smelled faintly of split peas, onions, and whatever scraps of meat had found their way into the broth. The soup was ladled into tin cups or simple bowls, handed over without ceremony. It was thick, almost porridge-like, designed less for elegance and more for endurance. Pea soup had one critical advantage. It stretched. Dried peas were cheap and plentiful. Add water, salt, and scraps, and you could feed dozens. In poorer districts, soup was not a starter. It was the meal. Hot liquid filled the stomach quickly and gave the illusion of abundance. On cold London evenings, that heat mattered. Coal smoke hung low, fog crept through narrow streets, and factory workers emerged exhausted. A cup of steaming pea soup was less about flavour and more about survival. And then there were penny sausages. The name says everything. For a single penny, you could buy a small sausage cooked over an open flame. Vendors turned them on iron grates while grease dripped and flared against coals. The smell was irresistible. Salty, fatty, unmistakably meat. The quality? Variable. Some sausages were honest mixtures of pork and seasoning. Others, let us say they were creative. In an era without strict food regulations, fillers were common. Breadcrumbs, fat scraps, sometimes ingredients best left unidentified. Street food was not built on transparency. It was built on affordability. Customers did not ask too many questions. They bit into sizzling casings while standing in soot-filled alleys, grease running onto fingers, wiping their hands on coats already stained from work. There were no napkins. There was no pretense. Just protein, salt, and fire. Together, pea soup and penny sausages formed the backbone of quick urban sustenance. One warmed from the inside. The other satisfied the craving for something solid and savoury. Victorian street food was not a dining experience. It was a transaction between hunger and heat, and in a city where time was scarce and comfort even scarcer, that transaction was enough. If eel belonged to the river, whelks belonged to the tide. Pickled whelks were not glamorous. They were small sea snails, boiled and preserved in vinegar, displayed in large glass jars that caught what little daylight filtered through London's smoke-filled sky. Their pale, rubbery bodies floated in brine, waiting for someone brave or hungry enough to try them. And many were. Whelks were cheap. Harvested in large numbers from coastal waters and shipped inland, they provided an affordable source of protein for city dwellers far from the sea. Vendors scooped them out with small forks or pins, serving them in paper cones or simple bowls. A splash of vinegar, a twist of pepper. Done. The taste was sharp and briny, the texture chewy, sometimes stubborn. You did not nibble a whelk delicately. You bit down and committed to the experience. But Victorian Londoners were not strangers to texture. Life itself was rough. Food did not need to be tender to be appreciated. Street vendors selling whelks often stood near markets or docklands, areas already thick with fishmongers and cargo handlers. The smell of vinegar mixed with coal smoke and the faint scent of the Thames. It was not the ocean breeze of a seaside town. It was urban seafood. For the working class, pickling served an essential purpose: preservation. Without refrigeration, vinegar was insurance. It kept food edible long enough to transport and sell. It also masked imperfections, which in Victorian London was often a practical advantage. Customers ate whelks, standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Conversation was minimal. The food required focus. Extracting each snail from its shell with a pin demanded patience and a steady hand. It was slow street food in a fast city. There was something almost ritualistic about it. Twist, pull, chew, swallow, repeat. Pickled whelks were not comfort food like potatoes. They were not warming like pea soup. They were bold, acidic, unapologetic. And yet, they endured. Because Victorian street food was not about culinary prestige. It was about using every available resource, river, field, sea, and transforming it into something edible and affordable, even if that something stared back at you from a jar of vinegar. What makes Victorian street food truly different is not just what was eaten, it is how. There were no cafe tables lining tidy pavements, no benches thoughtfully placed for comfort. Most street food in London was eaten standing, in alleys, on curbs, against brick walls blackened by decades of coal smoke. You bought your food, you stepped aside, and you ate quickly. Time was not generous. Factory whistles dictated the rhythm of life. Dock workers could not linger. Seamstresses had only short breaks. Street vendors themselves were constantly alert, aware that local authorities might move them along if they blocked traffic or drew too much attention. Eating was squeezed between obligations. Picture a narrow lane near the docks. A potato vendor's brazier glows orange. Steam rises from pea soup. A pie seller weaves through the crowd. Men in worn coats huddle briefly for warmth, each holding something hot in their hands. No one stays long. Street food was portable because Victorian life demanded portability. Many homes in poorer districts had limited cooking facilities. Some families shared kitchens between multiple households. Others relied entirely on purchased food because fuel was expensive and space scarce. Standing meals were not trendy minimalism, they were necessity. Hygiene was, by modern standards, questionable. Coins passed from grimy hands to vendors who handled food moments later. The same cloth wiped sweat, grease, and surfaces alike. Open air meant exposure to soot, dust, and whatever drifted through crowded streets. But hunger overruled caution. For many workers, the alternative was worse: going without. There was also a subtle social levelling in street food culture. Rich Londoners dined in restaurants or private homes. The streets belonged to everyone else. Dockhands stood beside chimney sweeps, labourers beside market women. Hunger made strangers temporarily equal. There was no performance in the eating, no cutlery to navigate, no etiquette to remember, just heat against cold hands and calories against exhaustion. Victorian street food was immediate, physical, and practical. It met the body's needs without ceremony. And in a city roaring with industrial noise and relentless schedules, that simplicity was powerful. Food did not pause the city. It moved with it. Victorian street food was affordable, but cheap rarely means simple. Behind every penny sausage and baked potato was a calculation. Ingredients had to be inexpensive. Portions had to feel generous enough to satisfy. Vendors had to earn enough to survive while undercutting competitors just a few feet away. Margins were thin, and thin margins encourage creativity. Meat could be stretched with breadcrumbs. Soup could be diluted with extra water. Pastry crusts could be thick while fillings remained modest. There were honest vendors, certainly, but there were also those who saw opportunity in ambiguity. Food adulteration was not uncommon in 19th century London. Milk could be watered down. Flour could be mixed with chalk or alum to appear whiter. Sausages could contain more filler than flesh. In an era before strict regulation, oversight was inconsistent at best. Customers often knew this. They just did not have many alternatives. When your daily wage barely covered rent, fuel, and bread, you were less concerned about purity and more concerned about fullness. A questionable sausage still meant protein. A thin soup still meant warmth. There were also environmental costs. The Thames, which supplied eels, was increasingly polluted by industrial waste and sewage. Smoke from coal fires settled onto food exposed on open carts. Airborne soot was simply part of the seasoning. Yet demand never slowed. Street food vendors operated in a delicate ecosystem. They relied on the city's poverty and its pace. They thrived in crowded neighborhoods where kitchens were scarce and shifts were long. But they were also vulnerable to police crackdowns, to bad weather, to rising ingredient costs. Rain could extinguish braziers. Frost could drive customers indoors. A new competitor could set up 5 yards away and steal half the trade. Cheap food came with constant risk. Still, the system endured, because for all its flaws, Victorian street food provided something essential: access. You did not need reservations. You did not need fine clothes. You needed a coin and an appetite. In a rigid society divided sharply by class, that small accessibility mattered. The streets fed those whom dining rooms ignored, even if the cost of that convenience lingered in the background, in the water, in the air, and sometimes in the sausage itself. When darkness fell over Victorian London, the city did not quiet down. It thickened. Gas lamps flickered along major roads, casting weak halos of yellow light. Side streets remained shadowed. Fog settled lower. The smoke from thousands of coal fires seemed to press closer to the ground. And yet, as factories released their final shift of workers, the food trade surged again. Night was profitable. Daytime vendors served dock workers and market crowds. Night vendors catered to theatre-goers, labourers finishing late shifts, and those who simply could not afford to cook at home. The glow of a brazier became a beacon in the gloom. Baked potato sellers were especially visible after dark. Their carts radiated warmth, the coals glowing like small furnaces against the chill. Customers gathered instinctively around the heat, not only for food, but for brief relief from the damp cold. Pie sellers walked through crowds with trays balanced high, calling out their wares. The sound of sizzling sausages mixed with carriage wheels rattling over cobblestones. The scent of vinegar from whelk jars cut sharply through the smoky air. It was not elegant nightlife. It was functional. Some vendors operated near music halls and theatres, ready to catch patrons spilling out after performances. A night at the theatre might end not with champagne, but with a hot eel pie eaten under a gas lamp. Others worked near railway stations, feeding travellers arriving late. London was expanding rapidly, and its transport hubs never fully slept. Where people gathered, vendors followed. There was also a more precarious side to nighttime trade. Street crime increased after dark. Vendors had to guard their earnings carefully. Police patrols might demand movement if carts blocked busy passages. Competition did not disappear with daylight. Yet the trade continued, because demand was constant. Hunger does not respect the clock. Night amplified everything: the smells, the noise, the urgency. Steam rising from soup seemed thicker in cold air. The crackle of fat in a pan sounded sharper. Coins exchanged hands faster. Victorian street food at night was survival under gaslight. It illuminated tired faces for a few moments before they disappeared back into shadow. In a city powered by steam and soot, the streets never truly emptied. They simply shifted into another rhythm, one where hunger met heat beneath flickering lamps. By the end of the 19th century, Victorian street food was more than a quick transaction in a soot-filled alley. It was woven into London's identity. What began as necessity, cheap, portable meals for a swelling industrial workforce, slowly became tradition. Eel pies were no longer just survival food, they became part of East End culture. Jellied eels endured long after the worst of the Thames pollution was addressed. Baked potatoes and street sausages remained staples, even as indoor cafes and pie shops began to appear. The street had created habits that brick-and-mortar establishments later refined. As public health reforms improved sanitation and regulations tightened, some of the rougher edges of Victorian street food softened. Vendors moved into permanent stalls. Pie and mash shops opened doors, offering tables instead of walls to lean against. Soup kitchens formalised. What had once been improvised became structured, but the spirit remained. Victorian street food had been born from industrial pressure, long hours, low wages, overcrowded housing. It answered a city that was too busy to sit down and too poor to indulge. It taught London how to eat quickly, cheaply and socially, even in the harshest conditions. And that legacy never disappeared. Modern London still carries echoes of those alleys. Food trucks parked near offices, fish and chip shops serving paper-wrapped meals, market stalls selling hot dishes to customers standing with plastic forks in hand. The packaging may be cleaner, the hygiene standards higher, the ingredients more transparent, but the rhythm is familiar. Buy, step aside, eat, move on. Victorian street food was not romantic in its time. It was greasy, it was smoky, it was sometimes questionable, yet it fed a city at the height of transformation. It fueled dockworkers unloading ships. It sustained seamstresses stitching late into the evening. It warmed chimney sweeps and carriage drivers. It filled stomachs when kitchens were cold or non-existent. Food, stripped of ceremony, becomes deeply honest. And in 19th century London, that honesty was served hot, handed over quickly, and eaten beneath a sky heavy with smoke. The alleys may have changed, the soot may have thinned, but the idea remains the same. When a city grows restless and hungry, the streets will always find a way to feed it. Long before stainless steel tools and reclining dental chairs, there was a simple bow, a cord, and a spinning stone tip. In the ancient Indus Valley, at sites like Mehrgarh, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary: human teeth with small, perfectly round holes drilled directly into them. These were not cracks from decay, not random damage from chewing. They were deliberate, precise, and unmistakably human-made. Someone, thousands of years ago, looked at a tooth and decided to operate. Tooth pain in the ancient world was not a mild inconvenience. Diets were filled with coarse grains ground between stone slabs, and tiny fragments of grit often mixed into the flour. Over time, that sand-like texture wore down enamel. Cavities formed easily. Infection followed. Swelling. Throbbing. Sleepless nights. And there were no painkillers waiting on a pharmacy shelf, so ancient craftspeople turned to what they knew. The same bow drill used to carve beads from stone or shell was adapted for teeth. A cord wrapped around a small drill bit, likely made of flint or another hard stone, spun rapidly when the bow moved back and forth. It was a clever piece of engineering. Effective, yes. Comfortable, almost certainly not. Imagine sitting still while someone holds your jaw steady and presses a spinning stone into your tooth. No numbing agent, no antiseptic rinse, just grit, friction and determination. Yet the drilled teeth found in Mehrgarh show something remarkable. In some cases, the holes appear to have been carefully shaped, possibly to remove decay, rather than simply destroy the tooth. This suggests not random experimentation, but intention, even skill. Some individuals even survived the procedure long enough for the drilled area to show signs of wear afterward, meaning they lived with the treated tooth. Ancient dentistry was not elegant, but it was innovative. It reveals something deeply human, the refusal to accept pain without trying to solve it. The first dentist may not have worn gloves or held a degree, But somewhere in the Indus Valley, thousands of years ago, someone took a tool meant for beads and decided it could also fight agony. And in that moment, dentistry began, with courage, crude brilliance, and a spinning stone. If the Indus Valley gave us the drill, ancient Egypt gave us something else, toothpaste, and not the minty, gentle kind. Egyptians were deeply concerned with cleanliness. They bathed frequently, used perfumes, and took pride in personal grooming. Teeth were no exception. Papyrus texts describe early dental recipes meant to clean and strengthen the mouth. The ingredients? Crushed rock salt, mint, dried iris flowers, pepper, sometimes even powdered ox hooves or pumice. Imagine grinding minerals into a paste and rubbing it directly onto your gums. Effective? Possibly. Comfortable? Not remotely. Egyptian bread, like that of many ancient civilizations, contained grit from stone grinding tools. Over time, that sand slowly wore enamel down. Teeth flattened. Nerves became exposed. Cavities developed. And once infection set in, pain followed relentlessly. So Egyptians did what they could with what they had. Their dental paste was abrasive, intentionally so. It scrubbed away debris and plaque. It also scrubbed enamel. But in a world without nylon bristles or fluoride, abrasion was the best available defense. They used small twigs as chew sticks, fraying one end to create a crude brush. The act of chewing cleaned teeth mechanically while stimulating gums. In some tombs, archaeologists have found toothpicks buried alongside the dead, suggesting oral hygiene mattered even in the afterlife. There were also early attempts at fillings. Some Egyptian skulls show evidence of linen fibers or resin packed into decayed teeth, possibly to reduce pain or infection. Whether these procedures were successful is unclear. What is clear is that they tried, and that matters. Dental pain in the ancient world was not a minor inconvenience. An abscess could swell the face, cause fever, and even lead to death if infection spread. There were no antibiotics, no modern surgery, just herbs, poultices, and hope. Egyptian medical texts describe remedies for toothache involving honey and plant extracts, substances with mild antibacterial properties. They may not have understood bacteria, but they observed outcomes. Dentistry in Egypt was crude, abrasive, and imperfect. But it was deliberate. They were not passive victims of decay. They fought it, with crushed stone, sharp tools, and remarkable determination. Because when your only alternative is agony, even a paste made of rock begins to look like mercy. While Egyptians scrubbed with crushed minerals, the ancient Greeks tried to explain why teeth hurt in the first place. And their answer was imaginative. For centuries across multiple cultures, people believed that toothaches were caused by tiny worms burrowing inside the tooth. The so-called toothworm theory described pain as the creature's movement or gnawing. It was a simple explanation for a mystery hidden deep inside the jaw. And when you cannot see bacteria, a worm feels reasonable. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and later Galen attempted to move medicine away from superstition and toward observation. They studied anatomy, documented symptoms, and categorized diseases. Yet even they struggled to fully escape inherited beliefs. Teeth were understood as bones. Decay was observed, but its mechanism was unclear. Why would a solid structure suddenly soften and rot? Without microscopes, microbes remained invisible enemies, so treatments reflected both logic and imagination. For tooth pain, Greek healers prescribed rinses made from wine, vinegar, or herbal mixtures. They recommended fumigation, exposing the mouth to smoke from burning seeds, believed to drive out the mythical worm. If the worm caused pain, smoke would flush it out. Patients sometimes even claimed they saw small wriggling creatures emerge during these treatments. In reality, these were likely fragments of seeds or debris from the burning materials. But when you are desperate for relief, interpretation bends easily. Extraction was also practiced. If a tooth became unbearable, it could be pulled. The tools were basic: metal forceps or simple levers. There was no precise surgical technique. The goal was removal, not preservation. Pain management was minimal. Wine dulled sensation slightly. Herbal mixtures offered mild sedation. But the procedure was raw, physical, and immediate. Despite misconceptions, Greek medicine did contribute significantly to dental understanding. They described gum disease, recognized loose teeth, and attempted early forms of dental wiring to stabilize damaged teeth. The toothworm may not have existed, but the suffering certainly did. And Greek practitioners stood at an important crossroads, halfway between myth and method. They questioned old explanations, experimented with treatments, and documented outcomes. Dentistry was still crude. But curiosity had begun to bite back. Because once humans started asking better questions about pain, better answers were bound to follow, even if it took centuries to fully silence the imaginary worm. If the Greeks asked questions, the Romans built solutions. Roman dentistry was practical, mechanical, and surprisingly ambitious. While tooth extraction remained common, the Romans also attempted something more advanced: preservation. They wired teeth together. Archaeological findings show examples of Roman dental bridges, false teeth held in place with thin gold wires. Missing teeth were replaced with carved bone or ivory, sometimes even human teeth taken from others. These substitutes were then bound to neighbouring teeth to stabilise them. It was crude by modern standards, but it was engineering. Gold was chosen not just for its appearance, but for its flexibility and resistance to corrosion. It could bend without snapping. It could survive moisture inside the mouth. Roman dentists understood materials, even if they did not fully understand bacteria. This was not cosmetic dentistry as we imagine today. It was structural. A missing tooth affected chewing. Chewing affected nutrition, and nutrition affected survival. Roman society valued practicality. A soldier, merchant, or labourer needed functional teeth, so repairs were attempted when possible. Roman medical writers like Celsus documented dental techniques, including instructions for extracting teeth carefully to avoid breaking them. He advised loosening the tooth first before pulling, a remarkably thoughtful detail for an era without anesthesia. And yes, extraction was still brutal. Wine remained the primary anesthetic. Herbal remedies were applied to gums. But once force was applied, the experience was sharp and unforgettable. There were also attempts at cleaning. Romans used powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, or charcoal to polish teeth. Urine, aged and fermented, was sometimes used as a whitening agent due to its ammonia content. It worked. It also smelled terrible. But Roman dentistry reflected a shift. Teeth were no longer passive victims of decay. They were components that could be repaired, reinforced, or replaced. The mouth became a structure to maintain, not perfectly, not safely by modern standards, but deliberately. The Roman bridge, with its gold wires and carved replacements, represents one of the earliest known efforts at dental prosthetics. It shows ingenuity in the face of constant discomfort. Pain was expected, innovation was optional, and yet they innovated anyway, because chewing without agony was worth the risk of a little gold wire and a lot of courage. While Rome experimented with gold wires, ancient China approached dental pain from an entirely different angle: observation, balance, intervention. Chinese medical texts dating back more than 2,000 years describe toothache not as a random curse, but as part of a broader imbalance in the body. Pain was connected to heat, inflammation, and disturbances in internal energy flow. And so treatment targeted both the tooth and the system. One remarkable innovation was the early use of metal fillings. By around the 7th century, Chinese practitioners were using a form of silver amalgam to fill cavities. It was not identical to modern dental amalgam, but it functioned similarly, a paste-like material that hardened inside the tooth. This was centuries before such methods became common in Europe. The logic was simple: remove decayed material and seal the hole. Primitive? Yes. Brilliant? Also yes. To remove decay, small metal tools were used to scrape and clean the cavity. There was no drill powered by electricity, no sterile suction tube, just steady hands and the willingness of the patient to endure. Pain relief came from multiple sources. Herbal medicine played a central role. Clove oil, which contains eugenol, a natural anesthetic, was used to numb toothache. It actually works. Even today, dentists recognize its mild analgesic effect. Acupuncture was also employed in some cases to manage dental pain. By stimulating specific points believed to regulate energy pathways, practitioners aimed to reduce inflammation and discomfort. Whether through neurological response or placebo effect, many patients reported relief. Extraction remained an option when infection spread too far, but Chinese medical texts emphasize preservation when possible, an early understanding that saving a tooth was preferable to losing it. Hygiene mattered too. Chewing sticks, often made from aromatic tree branches, were used to clean teeth. Salt and herbal powders functioned as early tooth cleansers. Chinese dentistry reflected a balance between mechanical intervention and systemic healing. The tooth was not isolated from the body, it was part of it. That philosophical shift mattered. Because while ancient dentistry everywhere involved pain, some cultures began thinking beyond brute force. They experimented, they refined, they observed patterns. And slowly, across civilizations, a common truth emerged. Tooth pain was universal. But so was human ingenuity. And in that tension between agony and innovation, dentistry continued to evolve, one scraped cavity at a time. By the medieval period, dentistry in much of Europe had taken a sharp turn toward spectacle. If you had a toothache, you did not book an appointment with a specialist. You visited the barber. Barber surgeons were the multitaskers of the Middle Ages. They cut hair, performed minor surgeries, treated wounds, and, when necessary, removed teeth. The iconic red and white barber pole is said to represent blood and bandages, a reminder that grooming and surgery once shared the same shop. Extraction was the primary solution. If a tooth decayed beyond tolerance, it came out. Publicly. Medieval marketplaces often doubled as treatment centres. A barber might set up a chair in an open square, displaying extracted teeth as proof of skill. Crowds gathered. The patient sat. A pair of metal forceps clamped down, and with one decisive pull, or several, the tooth was removed. There was no anesthesia beyond alcohol. Sometimes patients were given herbal sedatives. Sometimes they simply clenched their fists and endured. Pain was immediate and raw. Infection was common afterward. But when the alternative was a spreading abscess and fever, the risk seemed justified. There were also travelling tooth pullers, who combined dentistry with performance. They advertised loudly, promising relief. Some even incorporated music or theatrics to draw attention. The extraction itself became part of the show. It was medicine as entertainment. Of course, skill varied dramatically. A steady-handed barber might remove a tooth cleanly. An inexperienced one could fracture the tooth, damage the jaw, or cause severe bleeding. Yet despite the crude methods, dental awareness did not disappear entirely. Medieval medical texts described gum disease, tooth decay, and even early attempts at cleaning teeth with cloth and salt. But preservation was rare. Teeth were considered expendable. The philosophy was simple. Remove the source of pain. It was direct, brutal, effective in the narrowest sense. And yet, beneath the spectacle of marketplace extractions, something important was happening. Dentistry, even in its roughest form, remained recognized as necessary. Tooth pain was not ignored. It was confronted, publicly, forcefully, imperfectly. Medieval dentistry may not have been elegant, but it acknowledged a truth that stretched across all civilizations. When pain becomes unbearable, action follows, even if that action involves a barber, a crowd, and a pair of iron pliers. While medieval Europe relied heavily on barbers and brute force, the Islamic Golden Age quietly advanced dentistry with remarkable sophistication. Between the 9th and 13th centuries, Scholars in cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo preserved and expanded upon Greek and Roman medical knowledge. They translated ancient texts, questioned assumptions, and refined surgical techniques. And dentistry did not escape their attention. One of the most influential figures was al-Zarawi, known in the West as Abul Qasis. In his extensive medical encyclopedia, he described dental instruments with surprising detail. He illustrated specialized tools for scaling tartar, extracting teeth carefully, and even correcting dental irregularities. These were not improvised pliers. They were designed instruments. Al-Zarawi emphasized precision,